The fire was dying when Micah said it. Orange embers pulsed like a heartbeat against the darkness, casting shadows that danced across his face in ways that made him look like a stranger. But he wasn't a stranger. He was Micah Reynolds, the boy who taught me to skip stones when we were 12, who drove me to the emergency room when I broke my wrist falling off his bike, who called me every Sunday during my years in the city, even when I was too busy to call him back. The lake stretched out behind him, black as ink, its surface disturbed only by the occasional ripple that caught the firelight. We'd been sitting in comfortable silence for maybe 20 minutes, nursing our second beers of the night, listening to the soft lapping of water against the wooden dock his grandfather had built 40 years ago. This was our place, had always been our place. The cabin where we'd spent countless summers as kids, where we'd learned to fish and curse and stay up until dawn talking about everything and nothing. But tonight felt different, heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. I watched him roll the bottle between his palms, condensation making his fingers slick. He'd been quiet all evening, quieter than usual, and I'd learned long ago not to push Micah when he got like this. He'd talk when he was ready. He always did. The words, when they came, were so soft I almost missed them over the crackling of burning wood. I've never been kissed by a guy. My chest tightened, not because the statement surprised me particularly, but because of the way he said it. Like a confession, like something that had been sitting heavy in his throat for longer than either of us wanted to acknowledge. I set my beer down carefully, the glass meeting the wooden arm of my chair with a soft clink that seemed too loud in the sudden stillness. When I looked up, Micah was watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not curiosity exactly, though there was that. Something deeper, more vulnerable. His eyes held mine for a long moment, and I felt that familiar flutter in my stomach that I'd been carrying around for more years than I cared to count. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up into the star-scattered sky, and Micah flinched slightly. But he didn't look away. "Would you?" he said, and then stopped, swallowed, started again. "Would you be my first?" The question hung between us like smoke. I felt my pulse quicken, felt heat rise in my cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. This was Micah. My Micah. The same Micah who'd dated Sarah Chun for 2 years in high school, who'd been with that blonde girl from the next town over for most of college, who'd had his heart broken by Jessica Martinez just 6 months ago. The Micah who'd never once, in all our years of friendship, given me any reason to hope for something like this. I wanted to ask him if he was sure. Wanted to ask him what this meant, where it was coming from, whether he'd been thinking about it for 5 minutes or 5 years. But there was something in his face that stopped me. A fragility I'd rarely seen in him, like he was balanced on the edge of something, and the wrong word from me might send him tumbling backward into safety. The firelight caught the gold in his hair, turned his skin warm amber. I'd memorized that face so long ago I could draw it with my eyes closed. The small scar above his left eyebrow from when he fell off the monkey bars in 3rd grade. The way his mouth curved slightly higher on the right side when he smiled. The freckles that appeared across his nose every summer and faded by winter. But sitting here now, looking at him in the flickering light, he seemed both entirely familiar and completely new. My throat felt dry. When I tried to speak, my voice came out rougher than I intended. "Micah." He nodded slightly, like he understood everything I wasn't saying. Like he knew this question was changing something fundamental between us, something we couldn't take back once we crossed it. His fingers had gone still around the beer bottle, and I could see the slight tremor in his hands. I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake in my cramped apartment in the city, thinking about him. All the relationships I'd started and ended because they weren't him. All the times I'd come close to telling him how I felt, and stopped myself because I couldn't bear the thought of losing him. He was my oldest friend, my closest friend, the person who knew me better than anyone else in the world. And now he was asking me to kiss him. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of weight, full of possibility, full of all the things we'd never said to each other in 20 years of friendship. I could smell the wood smoke and the lake water and something else, something that might have been anticipation. Micah shifted in his chair, leaning forward slightly. The movement brought him closer to the fire, and I could see the way the light played across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the curve of his mouth. He was beautiful, had always been beautiful, though I'd trained myself not to think about it too much over the years. "Are you sure?" I finally managed to ask. He was quiet for so long, I thought maybe I'd misread the moment entirely. Maybe this was just the beer talking, or some kind of quarter-life crisis brought on by his recent breakup. Maybe in the morning he'd wake up embarrassed and we'd never speak of it again. But then he nodded, slow and deliberate. And when he spoke, his voice was steadier than I'd expected. "I've been thinking about it," he said, "for a while now." The admission hit me like a physical thing. I felt my breath catch, felt something shift in my chest that I couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe. Or terror. Possibly both. The fire had burned lower while we'd been talking, the flames smaller now, but still throwing enough light to see by. A loon called somewhere across the water, its voice haunting and beautiful in the darkness. This was the lake where we'd learned to swim, where we'd caught our first fish, where we'd had our first real conversations about what we wanted our lives to look like when we grew up. I'd wanted this life, this moment, for longer than I'd ever been willing to admit, even to myself. Micah set his beer down and stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. He walked the few steps to where I was sitting and held out his hand. When I took it, his palm was warm and slightly rough from years of working with his hands. He pulled me gently to my feet, and suddenly we were standing face to face, close enough that I could see the flecks of green in his brown eyes. The fire crackled behind us, and somewhere in the distance a night bird called. The world felt very small and very large all at once. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said quietly. "Neither do I told him, and it was the truth." He smiled then, small and uncertain but real, and I felt my heart do something complicated in my chest. This was happening. This was actually happening. "Okay," he said, like he was making a decision, like he was stepping off a cliff and trusting me to catch him. "Okay," I agreed. The space between us seemed to shrink and expand at the same time. I was acutely aware of everything. The way his breath moved in and out, slightly faster than normal. The way the firelight caught in his hair. The way he smelled like wood smoke and summer and something uniquely him that I'd been unconsciously cataloging for years. I reached up slowly, giving him time to change his mind, and touched his face. His skin was warm under my palm, slightly rough with evening stubble. His eyes fluttered closed for just a moment, and when they opened again they were darker than I'd ever seen them. The kiss, when it came, was soft and tentative and absolutely perfect. That kiss lasted maybe 3 seconds, maybe 30. Time had lost all meaning in the space between his lips and mine, in the gentle pressure of his mouth moving against mine like he was learning a new language. When we finally pulled apart, neither of us spoke. The fire continued its quiet crackling. The lake continued its gentle lapping. But something fundamental had shifted in the universe. I kept my hand on his face, thumb tracing the line of his cheekbone, afraid that if I let go this moment would dissolve like morning mist. Micah's eyes stayed closed for a long moment, his forehead nearly touching mine, and when he finally opened them I saw something I'd never seen before. Not confusion, as I'd expected. Relief. "That was," he said softly, and then stopped. Shook his head slightly, as if words weren't sufficient. "I know," I said, because I did. We stood there for another moment, the weight of 20 years of friendship settling into something new and uncharted. Then Micah stepped back, running a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture I'd watched him do 1,000 times when he was processing something complicated. The loss of his warmth left me suddenly cold. "I should probably tell you about myself," I said, though the words felt strange in my mouth. We'd known each other since we were 8 years old. What was there left to tell? But of course, there was everything. My name is Adrian Cole, and I am 28 years old, which feels both impossibly young and depressingly old depending on the day. I returned to Millbrook 6 months ago with my tail between my legs and a graphic design degree that had gotten me exactly nowhere in the city. Not nowhere, exactly. I'd had jobs. A string of them, actually. Small firms where I designed logos for restaurants that closed within a year and websites for companies that never quite found their footing. Enough to pay rent on a studio apartment with thin walls and a radiator that sounded like a dying animal, but not enough to feel like I was building anything lasting. Coming home had felt like failure at first. Moving back into my childhood bedroom with its faded baseball posters and the desk where I'd done homework for 12 years felt like admitting defeat. My parents had been kind about it, the way parents are when their adult children move back home. Supportive but careful, giving me space while making it clear the arrangement was temporary. The town looked smaller than I remembered. Millbrook had never been large, but after 4 years in the city, it felt almost miniature. Main Street stretched for maybe 6 blocks, anchored by Murphy's Diner on one end and the old railway station on the other. The station hadn't seen a train in 15 years, but the building remained, its red brick facade slowly surrendering to ivy and time. Most of the storefronts were the same ones I'd known as a kid. Henderson's Hardware, where Mr. Henderson still remembered everyone's names and their father's names before them. The used bookstore that smelled like dust and dreams deferred. The barber shop with its spinning pole and its collection of old men who gathered there every morning to solve the world's problems over coffee and complaints. It should have been suffocating. In many ways, it was. I couldn't walk down Main Street without running into someone who remembered me as the quiet coal boy, the one who was always drawing instead of playing sports. Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store still asked about my mother's garden. Tom Bradley, who'd been 2 years ahead of me in school, still called me by the nickname I'd hated in high school. Everyone knew I'd come back, and everyone had theories about why. But there was comfort in it too. The familiarity of knowing every street, every shortcut, every story behind every building. The way the light fell across the town square at sunset, golden and forgiving. The fact that I could walk anywhere I needed to go, and that everywhere I went held some memory of growing up here. Most of those memories included Micah. Micah Reynolds had never left Millbrook, and somehow that fact had never surprised anyone. He was the kind of person who seemed rooted to this place, like he'd grown up from the soil itself. After high school, while I went away to college and then to the city, Micah had started working at his father's garage. Reynolds Auto Repair had been a fixture on Oak Street for 30 years, and everyone in town knew that Micah could fix anything with an engine and most things without one. He was good at it too, had a gift for understanding how things worked, how they fit together, how to make them whole again when they broke. I'd watched him work sometimes when I brought my parents' car in for service. Watched the way his hands moved with confidence and precision, the way he listened to engines like they were speaking to him in a language only he understood. People in town saw Micah as steady, reliable, uncomplicated. The kind of man who showed up when he said he would, who helped his neighbors fix their roofs and move their furniture, who coached Little League baseball in the summers and cleared snow from elderly neighbors' driveways in the winter. He dated nice girls with good families, relationships that lasted long enough to get serious before somehow fading away for reasons no one could quite put their finger on. What people didn't see, what maybe only I had ever seen, was the restlessness that sometimes flickered behind his easy smile. The way he sometimes stared out at the horizon like he was looking for something he couldn't name. The way he asked me, during those Sunday phone calls, what the city was like, what it felt like to wake up somewhere new every day. When I came back to Millbrook, Micah had welcomed me like I'd never left. Like the 4 years and hundreds of miles between us had been nothing more than a long weekend. We fell back into our old rhythms so easily, it was almost frightening. Friday night beers at Murphy's. Saturday morning coffee at the diner. Long drives on Sunday afternoons with no particular destination, just the comfort of each other's company and the familiar landscape rolling past our windows. He never asked why I'd come back, and I never volunteered the information. Some conversations, we both understood, were better left for later. Or never. But now, standing in the dying firelight with the taste of him still on my lips, later had arrived whether we were ready for it or not. The invitation came 3 weeks after I'd settled back into the rhythm of Millbrook life. 3 weeks of careful normalcy, of pretending that nothing had changed between us even though everything felt different now. We still met for coffee at Murphy's on Saturday mornings, still drove the back roads on Sunday afternoons, but there was a new awareness in the spaces between our words. A hyper-conscious dance around something neither of us knew how to name. It was a Thursday evening when Micah showed up at my parents' house, hands shoved deep in his pockets, that particular expression on his face that meant he'd been thinking about something for days before working up the nerve to say it out loud. My mother invited him in for dinner, the way she always did, but he declined politely and asked if I wanted to take a walk instead. We ended up at the old playground behind the elementary school, sitting on swings that creaked under our adult weight. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of the campfire where everything had started to shift between us. Micah dragged his feet in the dirt, creating small furrows as he swung back and forth in gentle arcs. "I've been thinking," he said finally, which was how Micah always began his most important conversations. "I've been thinking about going up to the cabin this weekend, just for a couple days. Get away from everything for a while." The cabin. Of course it would be the cabin. The place where we'd spent countless summers as kids, where his family had been going for 3 generations. A small, weathered structure on the shores of Lake Whitmore, about an hour's drive into the mountains. It was rustic in the way that only old family cabins could be rustic. No internet, no cell service, just a wood-burning stove and a kitchen that ran on propane and windows that looked out over water so clear you could see the bottom 20 feet from shore. "You should come with me," he said, still not looking at me directly. "If you want to. I mean, if you're not busy or anything." The invitation hung between us like a question mark. I knew what he was really asking, just as I knew that neither of us was quite ready to acknowledge it out loud. The cabin represented something different now. Not the innocent childhood retreat it had always been, but a place where we could be ourselves without the watchful eyes of a small town that had known us since we were children. I told him yes before I'd fully processed the implications of what I was agreeing to. We left Friday afternoon in Micah's truck, the bed loaded with sleeping bags and enough food for a week, even though we'd only planned to stay through Sunday. The drive took us through farmland and then into foothills that gradually gave way to real mountains, the kind that made you feel small and significant at the same time. We didn't talk much during the drive, just listened to the radio and watched the landscape change outside our windows. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered it, small and solid and somehow timeless, like it had grown up from the earth rather than being built by human hands. The wooden shingles had weathered to a soft gray, and the front porch sagged slightly on one side where the foundation had settled over the decades. But it was still beautiful in its imperfection, still the place where some of my happiest childhood memories had been made. We spent the first day doing familiar things, unpacking our supplies, checking that the propane lines were working properly, splitting wood for the evening fire. Micah had brought his fishing gear, and we spent the afternoon on the small dock that extended maybe 20 feet into the lake, casting lines and catching nothing but enjoying the silence that only came with being far from civilization. But there was something different in the quality of that silence, a weight to it that hadn't been there when we were kids. I found myself watching Micah more carefully than I should have, noticing the way his shoulders moved when he cast his line, the way he squinted against the sun reflecting off the water. When he caught me looking, he'd smile, but it was a different kind of smile than the ones I was used to. More tentative, more aware. Evening came early in the mountains, shadows stretching long across the water as the sun disappeared behind the tree line. We cooked dinner on the small propane stove, nothing fancy, just burgers and beans that tasted better somehow in the mountain air. After we'd cleaned up, we moved outside to the fire pit that had been there for as long as anyone could remember. The fire caught easily, dry wood from the previous summer crackling to life with satisfying speed. We settled into the old camp chairs that lived permanently on the porch, cold beers in our hands, the lake stretching out dark and endless beyond the circle of firelight. This was when Micah usually told stories. Funny things that had happened at the garage, gossip from town, memories from our childhood that we'd told and retold so many times they'd taken on the quality of family legends. But tonight he was quiet, staring into the flames with an expression I couldn't quite read. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt full of possibility, like we were both waiting for something, though neither of us knew quite what. Finally, Micah spoke. "I've been thinking about what people expect from me," he said, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "About who they think I am, and who I think I'm supposed to be." He took a long pull from his beer, still staring into the flames. "Sometimes I feel like I've been playing a role my whole life. The good son, the reliable friend, the guy who always does what's expected. And I'm tired of it, Adrian. I'm tired of being who everyone else needs me to be instead of figuring out who I actually am." The admission hung in the air between us, raw and honest in a way that Micah rarely allowed himself to be. I wanted to tell him that I understood, that I'd spent years in the city trying to become someone I thought I should be instead of accepting who I actually was. But something told me this wasn't the time for my confessions. This was his moment, his truth that needed to be spoken into the mountain darkness. "I've always envied you," he continued. "The way you left. The way you went after what you wanted, even if it didn't work out the way you planned. At least you tried to become yourself instead of just accepting what other people decided you should be. The fire popped, sending sparks up into the star-filled sky, and I watched them disappear into the darkness above. I didn't answer him immediately. Sometimes the most important conversations require silence first, space for the words to settle and take root before you respond. The fire continued its ancient dance between us, casting shifting shadows across Micah's face that made him look both familiar and foreign at the same time. When I finally spoke, my voice came out quieter than I intended. "You don't have to envy me," I said. "I spent 4 years in the city pretending to be someone I thought would be more successful, more confident, more worthy of the life I thought I wanted. Most of the time I felt like I was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit." Micah looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something shift in his expression. A recognition, maybe. The understanding that comes when you realize you're not alone in feeling lost. The next day passed differently than the first. There was less pretense, less careful navigation around the thing we weren't quite ready to name. We fished again, but the conversation was deeper somehow. Micah talked about his breakup with Jessica, how it had ended not because of any great betrayal or incompatibility, but because he'd felt like he was going through the motions of being in love rather than actually feeling it. "She deserved better than that," he said, reeling in his line for what must have been the 10th time that morning. "She deserved someone who was completely there, not someone who was always wondering if there was something else he should be feeling." I knew what he meant. I'd had relationships in the city that had followed similar patterns. Good people who cared about me, who I cared about in return, but always with the sense that something fundamental was missing. Like I was playing a part in someone else's story instead of living my own. That afternoon, we hiked the trail that led to the old lookout point, a rocky outcropping that provided a view of the entire lake and the mountains beyond. It was a climb we'd made dozens of times as kids, but now our legs were longer and our lungs stronger, and what had once felt like an epic adventure took us less than an hour. We sat on the sun-warmed rocks, sharing a bottle of water and looking out over the landscape spread below us. From up here, the cabin looked impossibly small, a toy house nestled against the shoreline. The lake stretched out like a mirror, reflecting clouds and sky until it was hard to tell where the water ended and the heavens began. "This is what I missed most about home," Micah said. "Not just the place, but the feeling of being somewhere that knows you. Somewhere you don't have to explain yourself." I understood what he meant, though I wasn't sure I'd ever felt that way about anywhere. Even Millbrook, for all its familiarity, had always felt like a place where I was performing a version of myself that others expected to see. But here, on this mountain with Micah beside me, I felt closer to that sense of belonging than I ever had before. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when we made our way back down the trail. Dinner was a quiet affair, both of us lost in our own thoughts, both of us aware that something was building between us that we didn't quite know how to handle. When we moved outside for our second evening around the fire, the dynamic felt different again, more charged. Micah sat closer to me than he had the night before, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of wood smoke that had settled into his clothes, close enough that when he gestured while talking, his hand sometimes brushed against my arm. Those touches, brief and seemingly accidental, sent small shocks through my system. Each one reminded me of that kiss by his family's fire pit, of the way his mouth had felt against mine, soft and warm and impossibly right. I caught myself watching his hands as he spoke, the way they moved in the firelight, calloused from years of mechanical work, but somehow graceful despite their strength. When he reached over to pass me a beer, his fingers lingered against mine for just a moment longer than necessary, and when I looked up, I found him watching me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "I keep thinking about what you said," he said eventually, "about feeling like you were wearing a costume that didn't fit." The flames flickered between us, painting everything in warm orange light. "I've been thinking about all the times I felt that way too. All the times I've wondered if the person everyone sees when they look at me is actually me, or just some version of me that I created because it was easier than figuring out who I really was." He took a long drink from his beer, then set it down carefully in the dirt beside his chair. "That night, when we first came up here, when I asked you to kiss me, that was the first time in a long time that I felt like I was doing something because I wanted to, not because it was expected or because it made sense according to some plan I never actually chose. My heart was beating faster now, loud enough that I was sure he must be able to hear it over the crackling of the fire. "How did it feel?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I was ready for the answer. Micah was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were serious and soft at the same time. "It felt like coming home," he said simply, like I'd been holding my breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale. The admission hung between us like a bridge, fragile and strong at the same time. I wanted to cross it, wanted to tell him that I'd been holding my breath too, that kissing him had felt like the first honest thing I'd done in months. But fear held me back. Fear that this was just a moment of confusion for him, a brief experiment that would end with awkwardness and regret. As if he could read my thoughts, Micah leaned forward in his chair, closing some of the distance between us. "I know this is complicated," he said. "I know it changes things between us, and I know you have every reason to be careful. But I need you to know that this isn't just curiosity for me, Adrian. This isn't me trying something on to see how it fits." He reached out then, his hand finding mine in the space between our chairs, his fingers intertwining with mine like they belonged there. "This is me trying to figure out who I actually am when I stop pretending to be who everyone else needs me to be." His hand in mine felt like an anchor in a storm I hadn't realized I'd been weathering. I looked down at our intertwined fingers, his skin warm and slightly rough against my palm, and felt something settle into place inside my chest that I hadn't even known was displaced. We stayed like that for a long time, watching the fire burn lower, listening to the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant call of night birds across the lake. Neither of us spoke, but it wasn't the charged silence of earlier. This was something different, peaceful, like we'd finally found a language that didn't require words. When Micah finally spoke again, his voice was so soft I almost missed it over the crackling of dying embers. "I don't want to wonder anymore," he said. The words sent a flutter through my chest, and when I looked up, I found him watching me with an expression that was equal parts nervous and determined. The firelight caught the gold in his hair and made shadows dance across his face, and I was struck again by how familiar and strange he seemed all at once. "Are you sure?" I asked, though I could hear the hope threading through my voice despite my attempt to sound steady. He nodded slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving mine. "I've been sure for longer than I've been willing to admit." We moved at the same time, both of us shifting forward in our chairs until the space between us was nothing more than breath and possibility. I could smell the wood smoke in his clothes, could see the small scar above his left eyebrow that I'd memorized so long ago it felt like ancient history. The rain started just as I leaned toward him, a gentle pattering on the cabin roof that seemed to wrap around us like a curtain, sealing us away from the rest of the world. It wasn't the dramatic downpour of movies, just a soft mountain rain that made everything feel more intimate, more private. "We should go inside," I said, though neither of us moved. "In a minute," Micah replied, his voice barely audible over the rain. His free hand came up to touch my face, fingers tracing the line of my jaw with a gentleness that made my breath catch. This was different from that first kiss by the fire pit weeks ago. That had been tentative, experimental, full of questions neither of us knew how to ask. This felt like an answer. "I don't want to wonder anymore either," I told him, and then I closed the distance between us. The kiss was soft at first, careful, like we were both still afraid of breaking something precious. But when Micah sighed against my mouth, when his hand moved to the back of my neck and pulled me closer, something shifted. The kiss deepened, became more certain, more real. When we finally broke apart, Micah rested his forehead against mine, his breathing slightly unsteady. The rain continued its gentle percussion on the roof above us, and I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. "I thought it would feel weird," he whispered, echoing the words he'd spoken after our first kiss. "It doesn't. It feels right," I said, because it did. It felt like something I'd been waiting for my entire life without knowing I was waiting. We moved inside then, driven not by passion but by the simple desire to be closer, to continue this conversation in a space that felt more intimate than the fire pit, with its circle of light surrounded by darkness. The cabin's main room was small and warm, heated by the wood stove that Micah had started earlier in the evening. We sat on the old couch that had been there since we were kids, the same couch where we'd played video games and read comic books and fallen asleep during countless childhood sleepovers. But now it felt different. Sacred, almost. like we were creating new memories that would layer over the old ones without erasing them. Micah reached for my hand again, and I marveled at how natural it felt. How right. We'd been friends for 20 years, but this felt like discovering an entirely new person who happened to live inside someone I thought I already knew completely. Tell me what you're thinking, he said, his thumb tracing small circles across my knuckles. I'm thinking about all the times I've sat on this couch with you and wondered what it would be like to kiss you. I'm thinking about how I convinced myself it was impossible and how stupid I feel for not believing it could actually happen. He smiled then, small and shy and beautiful. I'm thinking about how many Sunday phone calls I spent asking you about your life in the city because I couldn't figure out how to ask if you'd found someone who made you happy, and how relieved I was every time you said you were still single, even though I didn't understand why. The admission hit me like a physical thing. All those Sunday conversations, all those careful questions about my dating life that I'd assumed were just friendly curiosity. All that time, we'd both been dancing around the same feelings, too afraid to name them out loud. How long? I asked. How long have you been thinking about this? Micah was quiet for a moment, considering. Honestly, probably since high school. Maybe longer. There were moments, times when you'd laugh at something I said, or when we'd be driving around with the windows down and you'd get that expression on your face like you were somewhere else entirely, and I'd think maybe I was in love with my best friend and just too scared to admit it. The words settled between us like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples that would change everything in their wake. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer relief of finally hearing spoken aloud what I'd carried silently for so many years. I love you too, I said, and the words felt like coming home. Not the romantic love you see in movies, though there was that, but something deeper. The love that comes from truly seeing someone and choosing them anyway. The love that builds slowly over years of shared experiences and grows stronger with each act of trust. Micah's eyes were bright in the lamplight, and when he leaned in to kiss me again, it felt like a promise. Like we were finally brave enough to step into the life we'd both been afraid to want. The rain continued outside, steady and gentle, washing the world clean for whatever came next. We spent the rest of that weekend in a bubble that felt separate from the real world. Sunday morning came with clear skies and the kind of mountain light that makes everything look like it's been washed clean. We made coffee on the old propane stove and drank it on the porch, our shoulders touching as we watched the lake reflect the morning sky like a mirror. But even as we sat there, fingers intertwined and comfortable in our new understanding of each other, I could feel the weight of Monday approaching. Of returning to Millbrook, where everyone knew us as Adrian and Micah, best friends since childhood, nothing more complicated than that. The thought sat heavy in my chest, though I tried not to let it show. Micah must have sensed my shift in mood because he squeezed my hand gently and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine, which was both true and not true at the same time. I was better than fine when it came to us, to this thing we'd discovered between us. But I was terrified of what it would mean when we left this protected space and returned to a world that wouldn't understand. The drive back to town was quieter than the drive up had been. Not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. Both of us processing what had happened, what it meant, what came next. Micah's hand rested on the center console between us, and occasionally I would reach over to touch his fingers, just to remind myself that this was real. When he dropped me off at my parents' house, we sat in his truck for a moment longer than necessary, neither of us quite ready to break the spell of the weekend. He leaned over and kissed me goodbye, soft and quick, and said he'd call me later. It felt both natural and surreal, like we were playing house with emotions that were far too big for pretending. The next few days passed in a strange haze. On the surface, everything was the same. I worked on freelance projects at my desk upstairs, helped my mother with grocery shopping, had dinner with my parents every night at 6 o'clock sharp. But underneath, I felt like I was vibrating at a different frequency than the rest of the world. Micah and I texted constantly, nothing dramatic or romantic, just the steady stream of communication that comes when you want to share every small moment of your day with someone. He sent me pictures from the garage, jokes he'd heard from customers, questions about whether I wanted to grab dinner on Thursday. I sent him photos of particularly ridiculous freelance requests, complaints about my parents' ancient computer, observations about how strange it felt to be back in my childhood bedroom at 28. But we didn't talk about what had happened at the cabin. Not directly. It was like we both understood that some things were too precious to examine too closely, at least not yet. Thursday evening came, and we met at Murphy's diner like we had dozens of times before. But everything felt different now. I was hyper-aware of the way Micah looked at me across the table, of the way his knee brushed against mine in the narrow booth, of the way he smiled when I made him laugh. I wondered if anyone else could see the change in us, if we were somehow broadcasting our secret to the entire town without realizing it. We were careful, though. We kept our hands to ourselves, kept our conversation light and friendly. To anyone watching, we probably looked exactly like we always had. Two old friends catching up over coffee and pie. But I could feel the current running underneath our words, the electricity that sparked every time our eyes met. It was Friday morning when reality finally caught up with us. I was at the hardware store picking up paint for a project my father had asked me to help with when I ran into Mrs. Henderson, who had taught both Micah and me in 3rd grade and who had an uncanny ability to see through any pretense. She asked about Micah, how he was doing since his breakup with Jessica, whether he was dating anyone new. The questions were innocent enough, the kind of small-town curiosity that was as natural as breathing in a place like Millbrook. But they hit me like a punch to the stomach, reminding me that we lived in a fishbowl where everyone knew everyone else's business. I managed to give her some non-committal answer about how Micah was doing fine and focusing on work, but the conversation left me shaken. What would people say if they knew? What would it mean for Micah's business, for his relationship with his family, for the easy acceptance he'd always enjoyed in this town? That afternoon, Micah showed up at my door unannounced, which wasn't unusual except for the expression on his face. He looked nervous in a way I rarely saw him, running his hand through his hair in that familiar gesture that meant he'd been thinking about something difficult. We sat on my parents' front porch, the same porch where we'd spent countless summer evenings as kids, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally, Micah cleared his throat and said he'd been doing some thinking. "I've been wondering," he said, his voice carefully measured, "if maybe we should talk about what this means. What we want it to mean." My heart started beating faster, though I wasn't sure if it was from hope or fear. "I know this is complicated," he continued. "I know it changes everything, and I know there are going to be people who don't understand. But I also know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and I don't want to pretend that's not true just because it's easier." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not just love, though there was that, but determination, courage. "I'm not asking for answers right now," he said. "I'm not asking you to figure out how we make this work in a place like Millbrook, or what we tell people, or any of that. I'm just asking if you want to try. If you're willing to see where this could go, even if we don't know what that looks like yet." The question hung between us like a bridge I could either cross or burn. I thought about all the reasons this was complicated, all the ways it could go wrong, all the people who might not understand. But then I thought about the way he'd looked at me in the firelight at the cabin, the way it had felt to finally say out loud that I loved him, the way his hand felt in mine like it belonged there. "You were never just my first choice," I heard myself say. "You were my only one." The words came out quieter than I'd intended, but they felt true in a way that made my chest tight with emotion. Micah's face broke into a smile then, small and shy and completely beautiful, and when he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. "Okay," he said simply. "Okay." We spent the rest of that weekend in a bubble that felt separate from the real world. Sunday morning came with clear skies and the kind of mountain light that makes everything look like it's been washed clean. We made coffee on the old propane stove and drank it on the porch, our shoulders touching as we watched the lake reflect the morning sky like a mirror. But even as we sat there, fingers intertwined and comfortable in our new understanding of each other, I could feel the weight of Monday approaching. Of returning to Millbrook, where everyone knew us as Adrian and Micah, best friends since childhood, nothing more complicated than that. The thought sat heavy in my chest, though I tried not to let it show. Micah must have sensed my shift in mood because he squeezed my hand gently and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine, which was both true and not true at the same time. I was better than fine when it came to us, to this thing we'd discovered between us. But I was terrified of what it would mean when we left this protected space and returned to a world that wouldn't understand. The drive back to town was quieter than the drive up had been. Not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. both of us processing what had happened, what it meant, what came next. Micah's hand rested on the center console between us, and occasionally I would reach over to touch his fingers, just to remind myself that this was real. When he dropped me off at my parents' house, we sat in his truck for a moment longer than necessary, neither of us quite ready to break the spell of the weekend. He leaned over and kissed me goodbye, soft and quick, and said he'd call me later. It felt both natural and surreal, like we were playing house with emotions that were far too big for pretending. The next few days passed in a strange haze. On the surface, everything was the same. I worked on freelance projects at my desk upstairs, helped my mother with grocery shopping, had dinner with my parents every night at 6 o'clock sharp. But underneath, I felt like I was vibrating at a different frequency than the rest of the world. Micah and I texted constantly, nothing dramatic or romantic, just the steady stream of communication that comes when you want to share every small moment of your day with someone. He sent me pictures from the garage, jokes he'd heard from customers, questions about whether I wanted to grab dinner on Thursday. I sent him photos of particularly ridiculous freelance requests, complaints about my parents' ancient computer, observations about how strange it felt to be back in my childhood bedroom at 28. But we didn't talk about what had happened at the cabin. Not directly. It was like we both understood that some things were too precious to examine too closely, at least not yet. Thursday evening came, and we met at Murphy's Diner like we had dozens of times before. But everything felt different now. I was hyper-aware of the way Micah looked at me across the table, of the way his knee brushed against mine in the narrow booth, of the way he smiled when I made him laugh. I wondered if anyone else could see the change in us, if we were somehow broadcasting our secret to the entire town without realizing it. We were careful, though. We kept our hands to ourselves, kept our conversation light and friendly. To anyone watching, we probably looked exactly like we always had. Two old friends catching up over coffee and pie. But I could feel the current running underneath our words, the electricity that sparked every time our eyes met. It was Friday morning when reality finally caught up with us. I was at the hardware store picking up paint for a project my father had asked me to help with when I ran into Mrs. Henderson, who had taught both Micah and me in 3rd grade and who had an uncanny ability to see through any pretense. She asked about Micah, how he was doing since his breakup with Jessica, whether he was dating anyone new. The questions were innocent enough, the kind of small-town curiosity that was as natural as breathing in a place like Millbrook. But they hit me like a punch to the stomach, reminding me that we lived in a fishbowl where everyone knew everyone else's business. I managed to give her some non-committal answer about how Micah was doing fine and focusing on work, but the conversation left me shaken. What would people say if they knew? What would it mean for Micah's business, for his relationship with his family, for the easy acceptance he'd always enjoyed in this town? That afternoon, Micah showed up at my door unannounced, which wasn't unusual except for the expression on his face. He looked nervous in a way I rarely saw him, running his hand through his hair in that familiar gesture that meant he'd been thinking about something difficult. We sat on my parents' front porch, the same porch where we'd spent countless summer evenings as kids, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally, Micah cleared his throat and said he'd been doing some thinking. "I've been wondering," he said, his voice carefully measured, "if maybe we should talk about what this means, what we want it to mean." My heart started beating faster, though I wasn't sure if it was from hope or fear. "I know this is complicated," he continued. "I know it changes everything, and I know there are going to be people who don't understand. But I also know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and I don't want to pretend that's not true just because it's easier." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not just love, though there was that, but determination, courage. "I'm not asking for answers right now," he said. "I'm not asking you to figure out how we make this work in a place like Millbrook, or what we tell people, or any of that. I'm just asking if you want to try, if you're willing to see where this could go, even if we don't know what that looks like yet." The question hung between us like a bridge I could either cross or burn. I thought about all the reasons this was complicated, all the ways it could go wrong, all the people who might not understand. But then I thought about the way he'd looked at me in the firelight at the cabin, the way it had felt to finally say out loud that I loved him, the way his hand felt in mine like it belonged there. "You were never just my first choice," I heard myself say. "You were my only one." The words came out quieter than I'd intended, but they felt true in a way that made my chest tight with emotion. Micah's face broke into a smile then, small and shy and completely beautiful, and when he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. "Okay," he said simply. "Okay."